Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. It's now been more than 2 weeks since the US election was called for Joe Biden, and by this point, one could have reasonably expected a concession speech from the other side. But alas, reason is not something that can be found in abundance in 2020, because despite Donald Trump's path to victory being functionally non-existent, he's continued to fight this battle in the courts. So today, let's take a quick look at this fight, where the lawsuits are going, what their goal is, and where this all ends, and whether or not you should even take these suits seriously, and to be honest if Trump is either. Before we start, for Black Friday we've dropped the prices of products on our merch store, meaning that a whole bunch of our stuff is currently discounted, including our Countries with Shoes pin badges. You can pick up a high quality enamel pin representing your country for only $4.49. Check out that and all of the other offers over on the TLDR store. It's linked in the description. Trump's legal team has now filed more than 30 lawsuits across pretty much every swing state that went Biden's way, alleging everything from lack of poll watchers to voting irregularities to unconstitutional voting. But that last point is probably the most jarring category, as in a few of these cases, most notably Pennsylvania, Trump's team is advocating for retroactively voiding the vote-by-mail laws and throwing out most of the mail-in ballots in the state, which is both an absurd legal argument and absurdly undemocratic. The thing is though, it doesn't really matter how absurd the team's arguments are. None of them seem to really be going anywhere. Judges across the political spectrum have looked at the arguments presented by Trump's legal team and basically said, really, this is the best you can do? In one particularly interesting case in Pennsylvania, Rudy Giuliani appeared in court to argue that because some counties had let voters cure their ballots, meaning they could fix signatures and ID issues, and others didn't, the state's entire vote should be disregarded and Trump should just be declared the winner. The judge, Matthew Braun, wasn't having it. In his opinion, Braun wrote, "This court has been unable to find any case in which the plaintiff has sought such drastic remedy in the contest of an election, in terms of the sheer volume of votes asked to be invalidated. One might expect that when seeking such a startling outcome, the plaintiff would come formidably armed with compelling legal arguments and factual proof of rampant corruption. That has not happened." Brown also posited that prohibiting certification of election results would not reinstate the individual plaintiff's right to vote. It would simply deny more than 6.8 million people their right to vote in the state, and that the answer to invalidated ballots is not to invalidate millions more. The spiciest part? Brown, the judge on this case, is a Republican. So yeah, things aren't going particularly well for Trump's legal team. A similarly worrying lack of legal basis can be found in pretty much every other Trump lawsuit. Many, even most of them, have already been rejected, and many others are likely to be rejected in the coming weeks. And it has to be said the couple of Trump victories have been small and pretty insignificant. But this all raises the question, what on earth is the point of all this? The message being promoted by Trump and his team isn't particularly helpful in answering this question. Why? Because it's simply not consistent. Publicly, Trump and his lawyers allege all sorts of voting shenanigans, but as soon as they're in the courtroom and being questioned by a judge, the argument seems to fundamentally change. While on Twitter they may claim that the entire election was rigged, their legal arguments are, well, honestly, I'm not even sure what they're supposed to be. But it appears that they're not entirely sure either. Perhaps the starkest example of this is Trump versus Philadelphia County Board of Elections, in which the president's campaign argues that there needs to be more voter observation. Publicly, there was quite an uproar over the conspiracy that all Republican poll workers were barred in the decisive city of Philadelphia, and this is a conspiracy that's been echoed by Trump and his supporters for weeks. But when actually questioned in court, the campaign was forced to admit that there was actually a non-zero number of observers at the poll, leading to Judge Paul Diamond's memorable retort of, "I'm sorry, then what's your problem?" Really, this entire video could be comprised of phenomenally sassy comments made by judges after hearing the Trump team's arguments. In the interest of time, we'll save you from a full list of examples, But the point is that while Trump and his supporters are making wild claims online and in press conferences, the rhetoric gets significantly more measured in court. I mean, Trump's own attorney even said in court, "This is not a fraud case. We are not alleging fraud. We are not saying anyone is trying to steal the election," which seems to run counter to pretty much every Trump tweet since the election. The point is that while it's easy to make big claims on Twitter, when lawyers get into courtrooms under the oath of truth and their bar licenses on the line, we see the reality of these claims. So clearly the point of all this is not actually winning the lawsuits, which would incline one to believe that these suits are all, in true Trump presidency style, really more of a public relations stunt than anything else. Frankly, it seems that even Trump knows that he's not going to be in the White House this time next year. In a pair of tweets on Monday, he appeared to acknowledge this, instructing General Services Administration head Emily Murphy to allow the transition of power to fully begin. And while in the same pair of tweets he promised to keep fighting through the courts, this certainly indicates that he's begun to come to terms with the end of his time as president. Whether or not Trump actually expects those court fights he's promised to continue to go anywhere is anyone's guess. His lawyers have explicitly stated that they'd like all of this to end up in the Supreme Court, so perhaps Trump hopes this will be his saving grace. After losing the first Pennsylvania case we mentioned in this video, the president's legal team released a statement saying, "Today's decision turns out to help our strategy to get expeditiously to the US Supreme Court. If you're confused, that's entirely fair. Losing a lawsuit is not generally a cause for celebration, and spinning it in any way other than a defeat is rather difficult, but Rudy's certainly trying. The thinking here is that they now can try and appeal this case up the line to the Supreme Court, which I suppose they think would just be a snap of the fingers to reverse the whole election, but this is the whole baffling part. There's obviously a lot of talk this year about the 2020 election and the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case that decided it. And before November, many worried that we'd end up in a very similar predicament, but we didn't. It shouldn't be a partisan statement to say that Joe Biden won this election. The only way that could be overturned would be the systematic disenfranchisement of voters who have already legally voted. And unsurprisingly, no judge would like to take part in said disenfranchisement. But Trump's legal team seems to have deluded themselves into thinking that the Supreme Court could change all of that. They appear to have looked at 2000 and come away solely with the thought, "Oh well, I guess if we can get the election to the Supreme Court, then we win," without any thought of what the actual legal case would need to be. Instead, they seem to be relying on pure judicial partisanship here. And they proved it again and again by presenting little to no evidence in court and just crossing their fingers that they'll eventually hit a judge who's so partisan that they wouldn't rule against the Trump campaign. So, with arguments based only on hearsay and lawyers who clearly need a very long vacation, Trump's legal team appears to be up a creek without a paddle. Point is, it's been a disaster, which leaves us with one final question. When does it end? The answer, it would appear, is not any specific day. With the failure of so many lawsuits, Trump's okaying of the transition process, and fading Republican support, it's looking like Trump's legal contention of the 2020 election will just slowly fade away. It's not going to go out with a bang, but with a slow, drawn-out, months-long whimper. You shouldn't be surprised if Trump keeps beating the drum on this one for a number of years, claiming all sorts of conspiracies that his lawyers couldn't even begin to present in court. Perhaps this will even be a rallying cry for a few sects of the Republican Party. But as a legal argument, the idea that the election was rigged against President Trump and the idea that his lawyers will soon swing it all back into Trump's court is absurd. And I know parts of this video might have sounded harsh, and it's not even meant to be partisan. The point is that this isn't a Republicans versus Democrats situation. The GOP too has begun to desert the half-underwater ship that is the Trump campaign. The list of Republican senators telling Trump to stop with the voters fraud shtick is ever expanding. The presidential election is over. They have more important things to do. Even Chris Christie, one of Trump's most consistent and prominent advocates, is fed up with it all too. The Republican Party wants to move on, and so, it would appear, does the country. Let us know what you think of this situation in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.